with the majority based in Australia, I wanted to pay special acknowledgement to this country. So, in the spirit of reconciliation, on behalf of Women in Technology Western Australia, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. We deeply pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. If this is your first time attending a WiTWA event, I'm thrilled to welcome you and hope that you will feel part of our family today. WiTWA stands for Women in Technology Western Australia. We are a group of volunteers who welcome people of all genders who support women and young people in technology-inspired careers. Our mission is to encourage the business change required to accommodate diversity and provide a network of support for women in technology, science, and innovation. We do this by hosting regular events, sometimes featuring a panel, or sometimes, like today, featuring a keynote speaker discussing their particular status quo challenging thoughts and experiences. Whatever the topic, the goal is to provide a forum for our members to connect, network, and be inspired. Another arm of WiTWA is the work that we do in high schools via our Tech Trails program, encouraging young students to consider careers in technology. Recently, we have not been able to do our school incursions as we normally would, and had to introduce an online version. We released 6 online modules last month and had over 800 high school students enroll into the online program thus far. One of the other very exciting initiatives we launched in 2018 was the WiTWA Tech Plus Awards. This was our way to highlight the great contribution women are making to tech in Western Australia. The awards are currently in its 3rd year running and provide a means for women and supporters of women to showcase what they have done to demonstrate progressive leadership or help overcome the blockers that women face. I will say that everyone attending today has already done something remarkable in your normal day-to-day without even thinking about it. So, if you have not yet nominated for the WiTWA Awards, we want to hear from you. Entries close on the 31st of July, and all details can be found on the WiTWA website. Now, today we're all here because of this fascinating book, Women in Leadership, Real Lives and Real Lessons, co-authored by Julia Gillard and Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. I got my copy from the wonderful Lou Poncherello at Boffins Books and found it to be a very interesting read about how gender influences access to positions of leadership and the perceptions that people have of women as leaders. The book features prominent women in leadership, including Jacinda Ardern, Hillary Clinton, Theresa May, and many more. But even though the women in the book are high-profile leaders, the stories are very relatable and present real-life lessons that we can all learn from. For example, what to do if you have a stern, resting face, or dealing with the expectation that you need to be a superwoman. It also gives suggestions for men making the journey to support women. We are very lucky to have Julia here today to give us a behind-the-scenes look into the book and the interviews with those featured world leaders. Julia will be joined in conversation by our fearless leader, WiTWA Chairperson Pia Turcinov, where they will discuss the radical shifts required to close the gender gaps and Julia's personal thoughts on the future for women and leadership. Pia is an accomplished executive and non-executive director in her own right, with broad experience across a range of industries. She manages a portfolio career, holding a number of advisory positions. She is an enthusiastic champion for diversity and enabling women, and is an active protagonist within the Australian innovation ecosystem. Pia will be allowing audience participation via a question and answer session towards the latter part of today's event. Very important, if you have a question for Julia, please add this to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So, a woman who needs no introduction, former Prime Minister, I have the pleasure of welcoming Julia Gillard. Since leaving politics, Julia has continued to advocate for gender equality, founding the Global Institute for Women's Leadership to help us better understand the challenges women face in leadership and the barriers that prevent them from fully participating in economic, political, and community life. She currently chairs Beyond Blue, one of Australia's leading mental health awareness bodies, is the chair of the Global Partnership for Education, looking at funding education in developing countries, soon to be the chair for the Wellcome Trust, a medical science focused charity, and the patron of Champion for Female Education, just to mention a few. Now, Julia would not know this, but I am formerly from South Africa, and I arrived in Australia in September of 2012. This was a few months after Ms. Gillard became the first woman to ever serve as the Australian Prime Minister. So for me, coming to a new country, not knowing much about the politics of the nation, I was suitably impressed, actually blown away, to see not only a female in a position of power, but an extremely strong and unwavering voice. In October 2012, that same strong and unwavering voice delivered her world-famous speech in Parliament on sexism and misogyny. Being new to the country, I initially just thought that was how Australians did it. A normal, straightforward, straight-talking day in Australian politics. And it took me a while to recognize that that speech was out of the ordinary and the guts that it took to make that particular speech at that particular time. Needless to say, I have been a fan of Ms. Gillard since then. So without further ado, in the theme of if you can see her, you can be her, welcome Pia Turcinov and Australia's first ever female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute privilege and thrill to have you with us. And as a woman who, without doubt, has got an enormous history of being in leadership positions and breaking many firsts, being the first and only woman to hold positions of Deputy Prime Minister, and leader of a major party in Australia, it wasn't really surprising to see your book hit the bookshelves. But we are keen to delve into the approach that you took because it is a little bit different, and also the women that you chose to interview. But before we do that, if you dare to indulge me for a moment, we are women in technology. I'd like to start off with a very simple question, which is really, given that we have all experienced this dreadful pandemic over the last few months and technology has really shaped our lives in a very different way, do you consider yourself a technophobe or a technophile? And on a Zoom scale, where are you? Zoom fatigue, 1 to 10.
I'd like a few more choices than technophobe or technophile. I think I'm not bad with my tech, but I'm conscious compared with many, many people who have joined us today. I'm at a pretty humble level, so I'm not going to overclaim. On the Zoom, I vary from day to day, I'd have to say. One of the things that I'm certainly finding is because so much of what I do is around the world, that the global time zones mean that I end up being on Zoom very late at night, and I do find it quite difficult to wind down from. I do think that whole thing about blue light, etc., is true, and you actually feel more wound up and perhaps tireder than if you'd gone to an in-person event. But with all of that, I wouldn't be able to do the work I'm doing. I wouldn't be able to be talking to you now without this marvellous technology. So it's much more blessing than it is burden.
Exactly. And I think probably like many of us, you will have found that your world shrinks a little bit into that screen. And then at the same time, it's really expanded as well. So a slightly more serious note, and certainly since exiting politics, you've very much funneled your passion and your energy into the areas of education, mental health, and women's leadership. And as Tracy mentioned, you currently hold the position of chair of the Global Partnership for Education, as well as Beyond Blue. So my question is, how has your work in the education and mental health sphere shaped your view around the role that technology plays, I guess, in a way of both positive enablement, but also potentially, as we know, a source of new challenges for individuals as well as the community?
Coming first to my work in education, the Global Partnership for Education is the multilateral fund that supports school education in the poorest places on earth. So we're talking about 70 countries, 2/3 of them are in Africa, some are in our region of the world like Papua New Guinea. but they tend still to be places of poverty, often low connectivity, and for those education systems which are still building so that they can offer every child universal access to a quality primary school education, and then looking to add to that at least lower secondary, technology for students isn't playing that bigger role. Doesn't mean that it's irrelevant, but it's not every student on a device. What the technology tends to be doing is supporting the teachers, and it's doing things like enabling there to be more sophistication in payroll systems and the like, which might sound pretty humble, but if your teachers have to leave the job and walk kilometres and kilometres once a month to go and collect their pay, which was the way it used to work in so many countries and still does in some parts of the world, that's clearly a disruption to education. At Beyond Blue, you know, we're big embracers of technology. Beyond Blue was at the forefront of offering mental health services and supports using the online environment, and we're still endeavouring to stay at that forefront. And one of the things we've been pleased to see during this pandemic era, we've been calling for a long time for services like access to psychologists and psychiatrists to be able to be through a telehealth mechanism, and that's been made possible, and we hope it's here to stay. Now, that doesn't mean that everything about the online environment is benign. We know lots of people end up, you know, bullied, trolled, looking at material that is very bad for their mental health online. And we want to be continuing to lift our voice at Beyond Blue about what is safe engagement with the technology and what some of the technology companies need to do, some more things they need to do to help people, particularly children, but not just children, stay out of harm's way in the online environment.
It is, I guess, that intersect, isn't it, between education, changing people's behaviour, but enabling them to access services that we often say that in the last few months have leapfrogged technology adoption probably a decade in many instances. So let's hope we can keep on with the positive changes and perhaps negate some of those more nefarious imposts that we are seeing. So with education as that theme, the book, let's move to the book, because that's really what everyone wants to talk about. And your co-author, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a wonderful woman, and like you, has broken so many ceilings, whether they be glass ceilings, which I want to touch on later on, or other. And I love the fact that you described yourself as a feminist, but she describes herself as a womanist.
Yes.
I thought that was a wonderful combination. And look, it's not the first book written about female leadership. And yet the way you've approached it, the way you've weaved together the global experience, the global stories, and also that broader international research, I think that is quite intriguing. So how did you come about the idea to collaborate in the first place? How do two busy women of your ilk and nature find the time to have a conversation about, you know what, let's write a book, we've got a bit of spare time? And why did you decide on that particular approach that you took?
Ngozi and I actually first met in Perth. She came for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which I hosted as Prime Minister and which was held in Perth. It was a fantastic event. And she was then Nigeria's Foreign Minister. Ngozi has been an economist all of her life. She's worked at the World Bank. She now serves in a variety of roles, but one of them, importantly, is chairing the Global Vaccine Alliance. So you couldn't be in a more important job right now than heading up the body that tries to make sure that poorer places on earth get access to vaccines. So I really came to know her in my life post-politics when we would go to international meetings together, she on the vaccine agenda, me on the education agenda, and we sort of gravitated towards each other, struck up conversations which rolled into becoming a friendship. And one of our constant themes of discussion was about women and leadership, things that had happened to us, and then we would observe things happening to women around the world and we'd chatter about it. And then Hillary lost, and that was a fair old shock, and we got more and more serious about the conversation and ultimately said, you know, we need to do something about this. And that's where the idea of writing a book came from. And right at that early stage of saying, let's write a book, we knew we wanted to do something different. I was increasingly delving into the global research base around women and leadership. I had gone to King's College London and pitched the idea of creating a global institute that researched on women and leadership. They agreed, and we're shortly to open a sister institute at the Australian National University. So I had my head in that. We were all, both of us, interested in women's stories. So we thought, let's marry the two. Let's, you know, bring people the global research base, but let's take key findings out of it, put them to real life women leaders and ask them, does this ring true in your world, or is this something that a researcher in a university has found but it's got no resonance in your life? So that's kind of the essence of the book. And then we build on that for a series of action-oriented findings about what people can do if they want to contribute to a more gender equal world.
So how hard was it to drill down to those 8 names that you ended up with? I mean, yes, it's probably a relatively smallish pool. I mean, that's the whole point of the book. But did you find that when you put the ask out, was it immediate, yes, we will talk about it? Or is there still a reticence, even at that very senior leadership level, to talk about some of these contentious issues?
Yeah, it was hard to get the list down. I mean, the first big decision we made was that we would interview women in politics. And we did that not because we wanted it to be a book about politics. It's not a book about politics as such. But we thought if we tried to interview women from all walks of life, from business, from technology, from the law, from the news media, and the list would go on, that would become too unwieldy. So then we asked ourselves the question, you know, which group of women experience this difference in gender treatment under the brightest, whitest spotlight? And we thought the answer to that was women in politics. And so we said to ourselves, if we can distill out the experiences of a number of women in politics, that should help shed some understanding more broadly about women and leadership than the political environment. So then, having decided, yes, politics, we knew we wanted to go to the President, Prime Minister level. So we started looking around the world. We wanted to get global spread. So that led us to, you know, names like Theresa May from the United Kingdom, Erna Solberg from Norway, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was President of Liberia, Joyce Banda, who was President of Malawi, Michelle Bachelet, who was President of Chile on 2 occasions, Jacinda Ardern in our region of the world. And then we decided to add Hillary Clinton, because whilst, of course, she hasn't served as president, tragically, we thought, you know, there's no woman in the world who's been through this more publicly than Hillary. And we added Christine Lagarde, who has served as head of the International Monetary Fund. And in that status, she's been to a range of global leaders' meetings, because the IMF head is effectively treated as a head of government level at those meetings. So we thought she'd have insights to share. So that's what brought the group together.
And phenomenal stories, both from a geographic point of view, cultural differences, race, different religious nuances. So I think it's a very interesting group of women that you managed to put together. And I was discussing the book with another woman this morning, just comparing notes about what we thought about it in the lead up to tonight. And she made the point that she read it and walked away feeling offended. And that really was, I just took a step back, and I have to clarify, she wasn't offended by the book or by your words, but by the sheer volume. She said, you know, just having all that ingrained stereotypes, prejudices, and those systemic challenges and biases that we deal with probably on a daily basis, summarised in the one place, really brought it home what a significant challenge this is, and that there is no easy answer for it. So I guess, is that what you intended when you set out to do, to really pull it all together and to shine a bright spotlight on it, to go, this is not just a minor issue or an issue for politicians, but for every woman and probably for every family out there?
I'm hoping when people read it that there are moments where they say to themselves, I can't believe that. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, that just shouldn't be happening in today's world. I also hope that there are moments when people laugh out loud, because there are some very humorous stories in the book. We wanted to make it digestible. But overall, what we wanted it to stand for was a couple of propositions. One, for women who are still shaping their futures, who are thinking about what they want to do in their lives. We wanted the message to come across loud and clear: go for it. We want you to go for it. But we also want you to go for it, understanding that there will be times that you're treated differently solely because you're a woman. And here are some strategies to help you through when you hit those times. And then more broadly, we wanted it to speak to men and women who may not be on a journey to leadership themselves. They might be past that period of their life or not have that aspiration. But we wanted them to take away some practical lessons about what they can do to create a more gender equal world. So I do hope that it's ultimately energising and gives people a bit of a can-do or how-to guide to make a difference, to make an impact.
Well, you have shaped it in that way. You've got 8 hypotheses in there with some very practical takeaways. And I will segue into one particular one which lies very close to our heart, which is role models. You spend a whole chapter talking about role modelling. At Women in Technology, our byline is the positive iteration of it, which is, if you can see her, you can be her. And we strongly believe, and in everything that we do, it's about lifting ambition and changing behaviours for all genders, absolutely. So in your book, you reflect that exposure to women in leadership roles enables women and girls to see the door open and encourages them to step through it. So going back even to before your days in politics, as a young girl, did you have particular role models that shaped the way you saw the potential of your future?
Well, I wouldn't call her a role model, but on the theme, if you can't see her, you can't be her. I did note as a young woman the election of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. I was born in the United Kingdom. My family are migrants to Australia. We came out here when I was very young, so I didn't have original memories of the UK or anything like that. But I obviously grew up in a household where my mother and my father followed the news in the UK. All their family was still there. And both of them were very strong Labor supporters, my father particularly. So you could imagine that the terminology Margaret Thatcher in my household often came after a few adjectives that I won't repeat in this very polite company. He was not a supporter of Margaret Thatcher. He was from a coal mining village in South Wales, so that very much shaped his view of her and her leadership. But I do remember the penny kind of dropping that women could lead nations. She's the first sort of role model, I guess, in the sense of seeing someone do it. Living in Australia, I'd just seen male prime ministers, and so I noted that there she was, a woman doing the job in the UK. Then much more personally and directly, a key role model for me was Joan Kerner, who was the first woman to be Premier of the state of Victoria. And that was a very personal connection because I got to know her through her son Dave, and we were involved in student politics together. So we were young people knocking around in a group that was involved in student unionism, got introduced to Joan. Joan became Premier, and I kind of had a ringside seat for her political journey. And we stayed in very good contact for the rest of Joan's life, and she was very significant to me.
So did that importance of a role model move with you as you moved up the leadership ranks? So, sometimes it's this myth that once you reach the pinnacle of leadership and you're Prime Minister, not that you know it all, but you are in control of everything. What importance does a role model play when you lead at that level? Do you still, can you still have a role model in that space, or does it become more about mentoring and support?
I think it does change a bit, and we actually put these questions to our women leaders, and I think it's partly a generational thing. Jacinda Ardern was the only one who really talked about the importance of role modelling for her as she was on her journey up in politics. Most of the other women said whilst there had been people who had been significant to them, they hadn't deliberately gone out to find mentors in that sense. I think the search for mentors, knowledge about mentoring in a more formalised way is a more recent phenomenon than many of these women when they were on the way up. And then when they were there, you know, it's a combination, I think, of incredibly time poor. And then for a number of these women, there's no role model who served at that level in their nation because they're the first. So we had conversations around what's supportive when you're there. I certainly remembered when I was Prime Minister having a conversation with a woman, Laura Liswood, who runs an international council of women leaders, and she came to Australia, and I had a fascinating conversation with her that I found really refreshing, because I did have burbling in my mind at the time, you know, how much of what I'm experiencing is about me and how much is it because I'm a woman? And she was able to help me work through that question. So we do recommend in the book that even at the highest leadership levels, women try and find occasional bits of time to sort of decompress around gender and to talk through experiences. And then more broadly, we do talk about role modelling and sponsorship and mentorship, and we end up trying to unpack what we call the role modelling riddle, which is to be a really good role model, you've got to not come across as superwoman, you know, I've got this, it's all been easy for me, you know, you just get in and do it, you can do it like I do, because if you present the image of superwoman, then many young women seeing that will actually say to themselves, I could never be like her. It's actually a disempowering image. And yet at the other end of the extreme, if you're constantly saying, you know, this is so hard, there are so many barriers, it's so difficult, that too can be disempowering. So we've got to find a place in the middle that is authentic, encouraging, talking about the joys of leadership and the reasons to aspire for it, but is also giving practical advice about what is still the gendered bit.
Would you and the women you spoke to have a view on male versus female mentors, or the combination of both?
When we talked to the women leaders, a number of them said that men had been significant mentors in their life. So I do think that mentorship can come from men and it can come from women. And by the time you're talking about sponsorship, and by that I mean people who are prepared to really put skin in the game for you, to say, you know, Pia, she's definitely the next one who should be put on the board or appointed as CEO or given the next major promotion, I'm vouching for her. By the time you've got there where someone is prepared to put their reputation and power in service of another, then we do need to be open to many of those people being men, because they are currently the ones who are in the best position to do that kind of recommending, just because they disproportionately hold the most senior positions.
Very true indeed. And were you ever given advice, and I think I can suggest probably the answer to this, that you wish you hadn't followed by mentors?
Look, I don't ever think I got a piece of advice that I resented hearing. You know, I was always glad for people of goodwill trying to throw suggestions my way. But ultimately, you've got to make your own judgment calls. You've got to test that against whether it resonates with you as an individual, whether it fits your circumstances. You're the only one who's truly walking in your shoes.
Absolutely. So always, your recommendation would be always put your own personal lens on your experience, as opposed to
absolutely.
So of course, a watershed moment for you, and I presume that there doesn't go a conversation goes past without somebody mentioning it, but 9th of October 2012, your probably infamous misogyny speech By now, it is a TikTok phenomena at the moment. I have earrings that friends of my daughter made, which has your misogyny speech imprinted in it in perspex.
Right, that's a new one on me. I hadn't seen earrings.
People's ears. I thought you'd
It's
appreciate that. But look, it made international headlines. I guess one of the questions that we had is it true that you really hadn't planned it, but you literally jotted down notes during question time? And I guess what was it that made the dam burst, so to speak, that particular moment, that particular day? Because we presume it was building up for a number of years.
Yeah, I didn't plan it. In fact, I didn't know I would be required to give a speech in Parliament that day. When I walked into Parliament that day, I thought I was going to the traditional version of question time, where the opposition asks questions predominantly directed at the Prime Minister and you answer them in the sort of hurly-burly and interjections and shouting that people are used to seeing when they watch a bit of question time on their TV screens. I expected that day's question time to be about issues of sexism, because the big political issue of the day was around the then Speaker, who had been shown to have sent some very sexist text messages. And so I was expecting the opposition to be saying to me, "Oh, you're a hypocrite, aren't you, because you supported this man to be Speaker," even though at the time I supported him. There was no way I could have known about the text messages, but you know, you never let the facts get in the way of a good story in question time. So I went in with quotes by Tony Abbott that I was intending to use in reply when the questions came my way. But against my expectation, instead of question time, when we were due to start, Tony Abbott jumped up and moved a motion of, you know, censure and condemnation in the government. And so he gave the first speech as the mover of the motion, and I gave the speech in reply. So I had the time that he was talking to just jot down some notes. And actually we used those notes in the inside cover of as a wash of my book, My Story, which is my book about my time as Prime Minister. So people can see how truly dreadful my handwriting is, and of what very few words the misogyny speech was ultimately given.
Well, I think the result spoke for itself and continues to speak for itself, because it inspires a lot of young women, even years beyond the actual fact. And we hear a lot about the gender bias and stereotypes around women supporting women, or perhaps women not supporting women. And that is a theme that you do pick up in the book as well. And first female US Secretary of State, of course, Madeleine Albright, phenomenal woman, is often quoted as saying there's a special type of hell for women who don't support women. So I guess from conversations with the women you interviewed and colleagues you've spoken to across the globe, how crowded is hell going to be right about now?
We actually asked ourselves that question writing the book. How crowded is that special place in hell? And are we all going there? And what we ended up unpacking was a few threads, some of them more optimistic than others. One optimistic thread is it is commonly believed that when you've got a sort of general benchmark in a community about how many women it's acceptable to have on corporate boards or in senior management. So that started off as one. It was all okay if you had one woman. Now in many places you've got to have two women, now being referred to as toucanism, which I like. But it's commonly believed that the reason it's sticky at that sort of low level of women is that the women who get there sort of pull the drawbridge up behind them and stop other women coming through. Research actually shows that what tends to stop corporations busting through and appointing more women is not the behaviour and attitude of the women who got there, but the conclusions drawn by male senior management, chairs of the board, CEOs, who say to themselves, once they've hit the sort of acceptable low benchmark for the number of women, that gender, we've kind of done that, we don't have to worry about it anymore. So we, in that sense, have been putting a burden on women's shoulders that doesn't properly lie there. It's not their fault. But we delve a little deeper and we do say, I think all of us would acknowledge that there has been a politics of scarcity around women's positions, because we don't get half-half routinely, half the positions in cabinet, half the positions on a corporate board, half the CEO jobs, and the list goes on, that it can be easy as women to come to the conclusion that the person you're in competition with is another woman, rather than fighting it out with another woman to get one of the 2 spots on the corporate board. Why don't we come together and try and change the rules of this game so women get half the spots on the corporate board? And so we end up using what I think is a wonderful quote, that the politics of scarcity isn't our fault, but it is our problem, because it prevents women acting collectively in the way that we need to bring about profound change. So I guess I would say it's important to keep in mind those fiery pits of that special place in hell, and to be thinking about what we can do to make sure we're supporting each other rather than easily succumbing to artificial competitions between us.
So touching on that notion of support, and especially if we're talking in party room meetings or international forums or the boardroom, where there may only be 2 women around a table, have you seen strategies that work in how women can create a bit more visibility and perhaps amplify the message? Because very often, and you've touched on this as well in your interviews, a woman can say something and it's almost glossed over. A male counterpart might iterate the same idea a few moments later and it's considered the best thing since sliced bread. So are there tactics that actually, practically work to amplify each other when we are in that common room?
I think there are tactics that can do that. And I do want to reinforce how deep these problems are, in this sense that the 8 women leaders we talk to, served or currently serving as presidents and prime ministers and the like, many of them, even not at that ultimate pinnacle of politics, but on their way up in seniority in politics, talked about exactly the phenomenon that you've just referred to now, where they mentioned, outlined a good idea and no one reacted, and then a few turns later a man said the same thing and was received as a genius. So I think every woman would have a moment she can recall when that's happened to her. Of course, women can support other women in that moment, can remind the meeting that it was really a woman who raised that idea first up. But I don't want to give a free pass to the men in that meeting. And we quote in the book some pretty astonishing research which shows that if you've got a meeting of 5 people and they're trying to wrestle with a problem, women will only get a fair share of the discussion time if the group is composed of 4 women and one man. Or put another way, once you're above 1 man in a group of 5, the men will dominate the talking space, unless the instruction to the group is that the conclusion you come up with has to be supported by consensus. And so either the number of women in the group changes the allocation of time to make it fair, or the need to make sure everybody signs off the decision changes the allocation of time and makes it fair. But otherwise, men dominate. And I think the people best positioned to change that are men, who can think to themselves when they're in a meeting, oh, maybe I should say a little bit less. Maybe I should ensure that everybody's invited into the conversation. If there is a woman who hasn't spoken, actually say, Helen, Susie, Maria, whatever, what do you think? What are your ideas? We'd like to hear from you as well. Men with power to structure how decisions are made can think about saying to the group, let's make this decision by consensus, so more people get a fair say in the discussion. Men aren't bystanders here, and I think we've got to call that out a fair bit, and the book does, and put some very practical suggestions to them for change.
I hear a message there probably to many of the chairs in boardrooms as well, that we can place that particular onus on their shoulders and perhaps ingrain that in the way that meetings are actually held. So in a similar vein, Christine Lagarde, when you interviewed her, and of course Christine, as you said, is first female French finance minister, first woman to lead the Central European Bank. She quotes as saying that women tend to be over-prepared, they overwork, and they come over-briefed. Did that resonate across the interviews, and were you able to, I guess, pinpoint a reason as to why we feel we need to do this?
It did resonate across the interviews. More women said that sort of thing, all of them in, you know, different turns of language, but all of them really talked about hard work, you know, that they worked harder, that they felt they needed to work harder. And often the analysis of that kind of statement by women is that women lack confidence. You know, the reason they work so hard is that they don't feel confident, so they over-prepare. But we cite in the book research that shows when you survey men and women about their internal confidence levels, you actually don't get hugely disparate results. Men and women respond to surveys showing an equal sense of confidence. So when people are looking inside themselves, it's not that the women lack confidence. But what the women do is respond to the signals in the environment around them. So there's a study of an engineering business, scientists talking about complex problems, and it was shown through research that the women spoke less. And originally that was seen to be a confidence problem. But when they dug a little bit deeper, what they actually observed was if a woman put an idea in front of the group that wasn't 100% right, she'd get shot down in flames. If a man put an idea in front of the group that wasn't 100% right, people would work to salvage the best bit of the idea and to ameliorate what was not right about the idea. And so in not speaking, unless they were 100% confident, the women were actually doing the smart thing. That was what their environment was sending them a message to do. And I think that that finding can be generalised well beyond that engineering science company. I think when you're one of the few women in the room, when you've got to a level beyond which many women, at which or beyond which many women have not got, you are aware that if you make a mistake, that the conclusion won't just be maybe, you know, she's having an off day or something like that. The conclusion is likely to be drawn that your error in that moment says something profound about you, but even more generally, something profound about the capacities of women. And because women know that, because at these more rarefied levels of leadership, they're hyper visible because there are so few of them, I think that breeds caution and extreme hard work, as Christine Lagarde refers to.
So on a personal note then, how did you, and you were in the centre of this arena for a number of years, and we were talking about Machiavellian subplots. I mean, we could write soap operas around what we saw play out in many ways. How did you keep yourself focused? How do you deal with those moments where, and forgive me if I'm being presumptuous, but I do suspect, being human, you probably had your moments where you thought, what am I doing? How do I do this? Is it all too much? I really don't want to get out of bed today and face that world. How do you keep moving forward, I guess? And are there any particular Julia tactics that just work well to, you know, your little own cheer squad?
Well, I was always well supported by the closest of my colleagues, by fantastic staff, but even more particularly by, you know, the people who were closest to me in my life and the people who have known me for the longest, the people who knew me well before I was Prime Minister and that are still with me now. And those people in your life are the ones, I think, who can most steady you, reassure you, nurture you when times are tough, because you don't have to present to them as, look, I'm you know, this leader who's supposed to be showing authority. You can show all aspects of yourself, and you can put down a lot of burdens in front of them. And I certainly made use of that. For me, I didn't really ever get to the stage where I thought I want to stay in bed with the doona pulled up. Yes, I got physically tired. There's no doubt that there were days when the alarm clock went that I was thinking to myself, just 10 minutes more, please, just 10 minutes more. But I was always driven by a clear sense of purpose. You know, I went into politics to make a difference. I knew what I believed in. I knew what I wanted to get done. I knew that when I was Prime Minister, I had, you know, the voice of Paul Keating in my ear, who is famous for the saying, not a day to waste. No matter how long you're in government, it's never long enough to do all of the things that you want to. And so that propelled me forward. And I did go to the extent of actually writing on a sheet of paper the purpose of the government that I led and keeping it with me, and, you know, getting it out on difficult days and rereading it to steady me and to recenter me on what it was that I had come to do.
So mindfulness and passion is what I heard out of that. It's a wonderful takeaway for us. So we're currently taking nominations for our Women in Technology Awards. And it's an annual event, and it's to shine the spotlight on women that do extraordinary things and wonderful things, but not necessarily, they don't have to be, you know, groundbreaking in that sense. Now, one of the challenges we're finding is that so many women, even though they're nominated, put that lens of self-bias on themselves. I'm not ready, I'm not worthy, I couldn't possibly, you know, I haven't worked enough, I'm not smart enough. That self-limiting bias, what would you say to women who are sitting there and looking at you and the others that you interviewed and go, look, they're accomplished leaders. It's easy for them because they're just good at what they do. They know what they're doing. It's obvious that they had to get to where they are.
Well,
You know?
you never know that about yourself until you're there. And we do inquire into the backgrounds of all of our women leaders, you know, because I think when people sort of see the fully formed product, and mostly with politicians, that's what we do see. We, you know, politicians break into people's public consciousness when they've got to quite senior levels of politics. So you're seeing the, you know, the fully formed or largely formed persona. What you don't see is the shy schoolgirl. What you don't see is the person who, you know, felt a bit sick giving the first public speeches that they ever did. What you don't see is the person who feels like they've made a lot of mistakes along the way. The person who went into Parliament and muffed up procedural aspects and didn't get it right. I'm that person. And each of the women leaders we spoke to would have been that person on their journey up as well. None of them sprung out of, you know, an elite family with a highly developed view that their daughter was going to be a leader and that they'd been hothoused for that leadership. You know, some of our women leaders came from incredibly impoverished backgrounds. So, you know, I think that should give people a sense of reassurance that self-doubt is with all of us. It's not something that some people or some women shed. It's with all of us. And I don't actually in many ways think it's a bad thing. You know, I think so many things are challenging and complex and contested about today's world that a bit of humility in the face of the challenge is a good thing. The older I get, the more instinctively suspicious I am of the people who swagger around saying, oh, I've got this. And if you note who's doing well and who's doing badly as leaders fighting this pandemic, some of the men leading countries overseas who were swaggering around saying, I got this, actually didn't turn out to have it under quite so much control. So, you know, I don't think, so don't worry about having self-doubt, but don't let it eat you either. You know, you can have some self-doubt, but don't let it undersell you or your achievements. A good thing to do, I think, would be to hand what you're writing over to a man in your life you trust and say, if this was about you, how would you rewrite it? And I think you would probably get some advice about showing a bit more foot forward confidence.
Brilliant advice. Thank you for that. Now, I've got a few audience questions coming in, and they do tie in a little bit to what we were just talking about. And what can we do to encourage more women and girls into politics? Because at the moment, female participation is woefully low. And certainly, I think what we're seeing play out on the international stage and the differences in perhaps leadership styles could suggest that it's being a reflection of gender. And I think we can all sort of imagine the two leaders that I'm thinking of here in this context. So what would you say to young girls and women that are perhaps worried about that very jarring environment that it seems to be?
Yeah, I think this is circling back to the discussion we had about role modelling, which is you've got to always remind that there's huge joys in politics and in leadership. I mean, if I had a time machine and could go back to my younger self and say, this is exactly how it's going to play out every moment. Here's the highs, here's what the lows are going to look like. My message to my younger self would be, go for it, go for it, go for it, because the balance in my experience is upside. I am incredibly positive about what I got to do. I'm incredibly positive about politics for women. So if you are someone who's got a passion for change, you want to change your community, change your country, change the world, in my view, there's no more impactful way of doing that than going into politics. So go for it. Please go for it. And I've got a message too for political parties. If we look here in Australia, I'm of the generation in the Labor Party that fought for an affirmative action target. We did that in the early 1990s. And when we did it, if you looked at the national parliament, both the Labor side of politics and the Conservative side of politics had abysmal numbers of women, 13, 14% women, like dreadful. And because the Labor adopted an affirmative action target, all these years later, when you look nationally and at state parliaments, mostly the Labor Party presents teams that are around about half-half. And yet, if we look at the national parliament, the Conservative side of politics is still stuck at less than 30% women. So, there are structural things that organisations, including political parties, can do that make a difference for the ability of women to come through. And someone will always idiotically cry, oh no, it should be about merit. But that is an idiotic cry, because if you believe, as I do, that merit is equally distributed between the sexes, and you see any institution, a parliament, a corporate board, a judicial bench that isn't around half men, half women, then that must mean, it must mathematically mean that there were women of merit who didn't get to go because of artificial barriers in their way.
The arguments just simply don't stack up, do they?
They don't stack up.
They really don't. So when it comes to leadership, whether it's male or female, I'd love to see us have a debate in 10 years' time, which is really about what makes a great leader as opposed to what makes a great female leader or a male leader. What are those three traits that you think really put a leader in good stead to make meaningful change happen?
Look, I think so much of leadership and the most desirable style is about context. And so, there's still a role in our society for very directive command and control leadership. When you're dealing with an emergency, when you're trying to command firefighters who are dealing with a raging bushfire, command and control leadership is required in those sorts of circumstances. But mostly in our societies, mostly today, people are leading in circumstances where those who are being led are looking for an enabling leader, someone who will listen to them, take their views seriously, help get the best out of them, chart a path forward, but one in which they can see their stake in the future. That's the kind of leadership I think that people most want, and that requires a blend of strength, empathy, some putting of the collective, of the team in front of self. They're the ingredients. Now, people would often stereotype them as male or female ingredients. Strength, a more male ingredient. Empathy, putting the team first, a more female ingredient. I actually think in many ways that's kind of baking the sexism in. You know, men and women's brains aren't different. We've got the capacity to lead in all sorts of styles. Men and women are socialised differently, and consequently many women receive the message that unless they blend strength and empathy in exactly the right proportions, they won't be viewed as an acceptable leader. But if I'm right that they're the kind of traits we're aiming for, then we should require every leader, male or female, to show those traits. What I certainly object to is the sort of stereotyping that women are more empathetic, therefore I'll support an empathetic female leader, but I'll never ask myself a question about whether a man's an empathetic leader because I don't expect it of him. That is putting an extra burden on women's shoulders, and we shouldn't do that. If we want empathy, then we want it from everyone who presents for leadership.
Well, I think anyone that wants to delve into that really has to buy your book and read the details, because I know you spent many a page around conversations of, do you show tears, don't you show emotion, how do you deal with it, what situations is it acceptable? So we simply don't have enough time to go into all of that detail. So as a final question, I guess, to you, Julia, you'll certainly always go down in the history books as being the first female Prime Minister, and I suspect the gender lens will always be there in that conversation piece. But also, you know, I guess there's still a lot more to come from you. So in the final iteration of your lifetime, many years hopefully down the track, what is it that you'd like to be remembered for in the end?
I'm at the stage of my life now where, and really I've been like this all of my life, I haven't been someone who's made choices because I worried about what the history books would write. You know, that in my view will take care of itself one way or the other, and I'll be gone anyway. So, you know, I don't worry about that. I worry about, you know, finding ways to do things that I believe in, where I feel like I'm making a real contribution and an impact in the world. And I'm at the delightful stage of my life now where I don't have to worry about, you know, what's the highest achievement I'm going to be remembered for. I've already ticked that box. I've joked with people, the first line of my obituary is already written. I don't have to worry about that first line anymore. And that gives me a lot of freedom to just pick and choose things that matter to me. And that's a you know, it's a delicious stage to be in. I'm very happy to be in it and to be able to bring to it skills and attributes that I was able to hone in politics.
Well, and just sharing all those experiences, I think, through books, and hopefully there's a few more books in you yet to come. I know that I'd love to talk to you about glass ceilings, glass cliffs, hairstyles, makeup. There's lots of stories that are peppered through that book. So we don't have time today, but I thank you. I really thank you for the bottom of your heart that you've joined us today. And I think what you've really made possible is to make these wonderful women leaders relatable to us. So even though the stories and the biases and the stereotyping played out very much in the spotlight for you and your contemporaries, many a woman reading that book will go, I have been there, perhaps in a more private space, but I can relate. So there's great value in that, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. That was a great conversation. Thank you, Pia.
Thank you, Julia.
That was absolutely amazing. Thank you, ladies. Now, another woman who needs little introduction, former advisor to the West Australian Government on Science, Innovation and Technology, a science ambassador both locally and internationally, former Chief Scientist of Western Australia, WA's Women Hall of Fame inductee, WA Australian of the Year for 2015, and a WiTWA patron. I would like to introduce our friend and supporter, Professor Lynn Beasley, to give us a vote of thanks.
Gosh, where do you start to give a vote of thanks to the wonderful Julia Gillard? There are so many thank yous that I'd like to say, but the first one is to say Thank you for applying your intellect, your experience, your empathy and energy to making the world a better place. You have displayed today just how much that you work in a real world. You've brought a sense of humor to everything that we've listened to, and a sense of balance too. I've been watching the chat line while you've been talking. I have to say the messages that have really come across are the confidence that you have inspired. The decompressing message has been really important too. And I have to tell you, lots of people would like to get the earrings. So thank you. You've been a brilliant role model. It's so important. Thank you also for your book. I've absolutely enjoyed dipping into it. I'm still reading it. I have to tell you, it's selling like hotcakes here in Perth. The messages it gets across about glass ceilings, we all know about that. But I hadn't thought about the glass labyrinth and the awful glass cliff at the end sometimes. These are inspiring messages and we'll all resonate to them. And it's great to hear that your co-author, you actually met her right here in Perth at Chogham. That's a wonderful link to us. But we also feel very close to you because Dr. Gillard, you are have a doctorate from Curtin University. Many congratulations. So we feel that personal connection. But to be part of the WiTWA family now, if you can see her, you can be her. That message really fits with what you said today, that some will become leaders, but we will all work for gender equity. And to have the message you have given, it's going across the world. We have people in Sweden, in South Africa, and all across Australia and many other countries tuned in today with extremely positive feedback, I have to say, all the way through. Perhaps some leaders in those countries and others will be inspired in industry, in government, in academic community, whatever way that they wish to pursue their careers, that they're going to take from your message today and from the book. So thank you so very much. Thank you, the Honourable Julia Gillard, AC. It's totally appropriate that you hold the Companion of the Order of Australia, the highest order that we can give in Australia. It's completely appropriate you hold that honour. And we've been honoured to share this conversation with you today. We've benefited by your wise counsel, we've enjoyed your humour, and we've got lots of take-home messages so that we can go out. People of all genders, as you say, it's not just for women, it's us all working together to make everything work. So I'm going to finally just quote from someone on the chat line who I think will represent all of us who've taken part today. Apart from thanking the WiTWA team, you've done a great job. But the quote was, "From the depth of my heart, thank you, Julia." I think we all agree with that. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also want to add to that a special thank you to CyberCX, who provided the platform that we're using to host this event on, and didn't even blink an eye when we asked them to upgrade their subscription option when we had more than 1,000 people register for the event. We are so incredibly thankful for your continued support, CyberCX. Just remember, support local. Get your copy of Julia's book and Ngozi's book, Women in Leadership, from Boffins Books. Not only are they offering a 20% discount, but they also have really quick delivery to get it to you nice and fast. And finally, you've heard Julia and Pia talk about standing in the spotlight. If you or someone near you deserves to have that spotlight on them because they are excelling in their chosen field, please nominate them for the WiTWA Awards. You have 1 week remaining to nominate. If you are not sure how to nominate or what to say, please join us for an award submission masterclass on Sunday. Remember the WiTWA conference in October. All details can be found on the WiTWA website. And if you like what we do, feel free to give us a follow on the socials at Women in Tech WA. Thank you, Ms. Julia Gillard. Thank you, Professor Lynn Beasley and Pia Turcinov for the scintillating conversation today. A very special thank you to Lou Pontarolo from Boffins Books, Natasha Ferguson and CyberCX for your help behind the scenes. Thank you to everyone attending from far and wide. Good night, Borda, and for my friends joining from South Africa, Hambani Gashle. See you next time.